I expect 4 verses today. This translation notes webinar is meant to address the lexical and grammatical questions that come up when translating the text of, in this case, Mark from Greek into English. I want to just note again that this is not as feature focused as many of our other webinars are, although we will use accordance the whole hour. This handout that you're seeing on my screen is available to you if you're here live in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can find that in the handouts section. And whether you're here live now or watching this later on our recorded version of this webinar, you can access this and all the other handouts for this series at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. And my email address is abramkj@accordancebible.com if you wish to get in touch. Let's review where we were last time, and then we'll start with some new material today. Mark 14:42 through 46, this is Jesus speaking. He has predicted the betrayal that's coming from Judas in particular, and so he says now as Judas approaches, get up, let's go. Behold, the one who betrays me is approaching. Mark continues, and immediately, while Jesus was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, approached, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs. The crowd was from the high priests and law experts and elders. And then Mark gives us this background information. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Apprehend him, or arrest him, seize him, and take him away under guard. And as soon as he arrived, he being Judas, he went up to Jesus saying, Rabbi, and he kissed him. So there's the sign that Mark has just given us. Then they put hands on him and apprehended him. So they've got Jesus now under their physical control, and that's where we pick up today with Mark 14:47. Let me just put this out of full screen. All right, so I'm going to go to accordance for this now. Mark 14:47. And we get haste de tiston pares de katon, spasamenos ten makairon, epaisen tam doulan tu archiereos, kaiaphelen autu ta hotarion. Left to right, this would read something like now or but or and one, and this tis here is textually uncertain because of the brackets. Max and Mary in their grammatical analysis say if it's present it would be pleonastic, so it's really saying the same thing as one of, or a certain one of. You could translate it that way if you include that. Now a certain one of those standing by. So we have from paristemi, which is histemi plus the para, so those standing by, drawing the sword or drawing his sword, struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And one commentary notes that this word for ear is the diminutive form. You can see this here in BDAG, and so it could mean part of his ear. But for now, we're just going to say ear in translation. All right, let's see what I've got here. A smoother translation than just left to right. And one of those standing by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. We've got haeston pares de katon, one of those standing by. And standing by, we can see here, this is a participle, perfect active participle masculine plural genitive. It's used as a noun, one of those standing by. Of course, this is what they're doing, but it's identifying the class of people who are doing this thing, and they're standing by. And I don't think Mark is commenting so much on the action, so as much as he is naming the group of people. So he's not saying they were standing around or they were just standing there. He's talking about bystanders. And some translations will render this as bystanders. They were standing by. And you've got this histemi, standing with the para, and so that prefix gives us by, standing by. We can see BDAG. We have to scroll down a ways, but here's BDAG. that this word can be used of personal beings standing near or standing by who were present with someone. So you could translate it as one of the bystanders. It may be, and this just will vary, but folks may take bystanders with the connotation of someone who's just not doing something, or you know, if you think about an innocent bystander, it's someone who's around when something terrible happens, but they're not involved in it. But Mark's not commenting on that. He's really just saying bystanders in the literal sense. So if you think bystanders has more connotations than you want, maybe avoid that in translation. But he's just saying those who were standing there, you could translate it that way as well. One of those who was standing there. And now what did this one do? We've got spasamenas tain makairon. So that's drawing the sword, or drawing his sword. Struck, aorist indicative. And I think this is best translated as two finite verbs. You can see in the Greek diagrams that we've got this participle here, spasamenas, and it modifies the two main verbs of striking and cutting off. But I think this qualifies as a participle of attendant circumstance. We've seen that several times, and Mark will see it again in this passage. And so I think these can all just be translated as indicatives if you like. And so that would be drew his sword and struck and cut off. If you wish to preserve the participle as ing in English to show that it's a participle, you could say, as I don't remember which translation does, but drawing his sword, comma, struck the servant. So you could translate it that way as well. But even on purely grammatical grounds, we're justified because if you understand this as a participle of attendant circumstance, it's okay to translate it as a main verb. Greek functions that way. So it's not like you're being you know, untrue to the participle. You're actually translating it well if you do that. But you could also keep the participle as such with the ing. It just depends on what your goals are for translation. If your goal is that somebody could read the Greek off of the English, then you want to go with ing. So he struck the servant of the high priest, cut off his ear. Now, this is presumably one fluid motion. It's interesting to me that Mark gives us two indicative verbs separated by the chi. The NIV here actually kind of goes the opposite direction of what we did here with the participle and the indicative. It turns one of these into a participle. He struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now, I think this is a very good description of how that motion would actually work. I mean, Mark is not describing this as two distinct moments in time. This is, you know, just imagine an arm going back and then forward. It is both striking and cutting off at the same time. And, you know, we don't want to use too much imagination to get too gory here. But this, I think, is why the NIV gives us, he struck the servant of the high priest, the result being that he cut off his ear. But Mark just gives it to us as two indicative verbs, and you can see those here in the diagrams, that they're both separated by that chi. I don't think this is a highly consequential decision in translation, but it is something to be aware of, and you can decide what makes the most sense to you. So he cut off his ear, hotarion, and I don't have anything about this in my notes, but just to say, if this is the, well, it is the diminutive form. If we wanted ear, we would have hota, and I can scroll up to find that, or scroll down or somewhere. Here, BDAG tells us this is the, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, us is the, what is the diminutive form of. So BDAG is saying this is the outer ear, or another commentator says it's the lobe. I think you'd certainly be justified in doing that in translation. I'm not sure how important that is, but the fact that this is not the word ear per se, it could be that what Mark is trying to say is he cut off a piece of the ear. And maybe you translate it that way and you don't even specify, because Mark is not giving us an ear anatomy lesson here. He's just saying this person struck off part of the ear, piece of the ear, part of the ear. That might be the way to translate that. And again, not to get too graphic with this, although it is a very graphic moment, but we don't get the sense that the whole ear is coming off necessarily. And you could explore more about this. Now, this gets us into, I think, what's a pretty basic philosophy of translation, which is that we want to translate the gospel that we're translating, and we don't need to translate and import the other gospel accounts. If you were doing what's called a gospel synthesis, you might do that, and there have been many efforts at that over the years to blend them together into one account and understand how they all work together. So you could review it, certainly just to understand the passage and the event as an event. You could review commentaries, like France does some good coverage here, both of this whole striking incident, but also the parallel gospel accounts. We in fact find that this haste, one of those standing there, is in fact one of the disciples, is in fact given by, I think it's John, to be none other than, well, let's just look at it. Let's go to, here's the easiest way to do this. Go to info pane, parallel passages. Here's the quickest way, I think, to get to the parallel passages. And here's John. And we can see here, Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. That gives us full on cut off, even though it's using, well, yeah, that's a different verb. Anyway, so you could do an interesting compare and contrast here, both with the action, although the recipient of this horrible act, painful act, is the one and the same high priest, slave, or servant. So it's clearly the same event, but here it's identified as being Peter. And so I mention that just to say that, yes, you can get more specific, or perhaps like me, you're reading this text in Mark and you're thinking, interesting that Mark says one of those, wasn't it Peter? Well, yeah, according to John, it was Peter. And Mark isn't contradicting that. He's just not naming him. Now, we could wonder about that, which could be fun. We could think about Peter's association and close connection to the Gospel of Mark. We could wonder, is there a sort of anonymizing here to preserve Peter's dignity and keep him from shame? That's possible. I would doubt that, because Peter is shown in Mark to be foolish and working against Jesus. So I don't know why Mark doesn't name him as such, but those are interesting questions, I think, that go beyond the scope of translation. In other words, you don't have to answer them for your translation. The goal is to translate Mark as Mark gives it, with the level of detail that Mark gives. And so I just want to point that out, because this is an interesting case study where you do get more information in another gospel about who this otherwise vague haste is. Well, let's pause there. That's what I've got on the first verse. There's much more here that we could go into that I think is interesting, but let me just, as far as features go, to get into the parallel gospel accounts, you could have gone to your library and typed in something like Alond and go to gospel parallels, and you can open them this way. But what I find personally most useful is, if I'm already in Mark, which we are for this series, I'll get the info pane open and I'll know that I've got the parallel passages right here. And so I can click them from here. I can do one of two things. I can look at the passages themselves, hyperlinked here in the instant details, accessible by a click and hold and a pop over instant details. I can also click, as I did just now, and read that. I'm not actually opening the parallels tool, I'm just opening the parallel passage. But if you wanted to open the full parallels tool, just click not on the passage, but on, say, the heading here, Jesus arrested. And now you're going to show this in your gospel parallels. You may need to resize it so that it shows all of your panes, because you're going to want to see John there. That little arrow indicates that John is there. So if you want, now you can read the whole thing in parallel. All right, let's pause and see questions or comments that you've got. All right, here's an interesting comment. I'll put that in the chat. Someone says, clearly Peter was not aiming for the ear. The fisherman missed the neck of the slave of the high priest. That's an interesting comment. There's, I can't tell you which commentary it is, but it said something similar. Maybe it was in the SIL exegetical commentary. Let me just pull that up. Who is the man who drew his sword? So we've got that. Yeah, here we go. This is from Linsky, who says, when he tried to split the man's head wide open, only the ear was sheared off, because the slave probably dodged and used his heavy shoulder armor to stop the sword from doing any other damage. Mark says nothing about how Jesus healed the slave's ear, which you would see elsewhere. And then here's this comment about the diminutive. Now, Mark isn't crystal clear on any of this stuff, and he doesn't say it explicitly, but you could decide, does that seem like a plausible explanation to you, and what is Peter after anyway? So that's definitely an interesting interpretation, that yeah, he was going for more than the ear. Another comment here, I'll put it in the chat. Someone says Mark has a Reader's Digest version of this event. Much more information is included in the other three Gospels. None is contradictory. And that, I think, kind of dovetails with this idea of a gospel harmony, where you've got the Gospels kind of put together either as one or side by side by side by side. The idea being that, yes, they don't contradict each other. They give different accounts, but not contradictory accounts, and you see them in the same kind of one setting. So that's long been a goal of readers of the Gospels and interpreters, is to see them as a harmony. So that's always something, and I don't always mention this in our translation notes webinar, but from time to time I like to. I mean, we're going to see, especially as we move now into these final days, you're much more likely to have gospel accounts, all four Gospels treating the same events when it comes to the run up to the crucifixion, the resurrection. So I think maybe it doesn't find its way into your translation per se, but certainly in the notes, and I think you'll find in commentaries and even in the SIL exegetical summary series, they'll note this, probably because you or your readers are wondering about this not naming of Peter. Maybe this is clearly Peter in your mind already because of John, but that's in John. And so in Mark, it's in one of those standing by, drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Any other comments or questions on this verse? All right, here's another comment from somebody else. To slice off an ear, you have to be taking the sword from top to bottom or bottom to top. Vertical, most swords are used horizontally. Implication, Peter is not a sword fighter. Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty fair interpretation, that, yeah, and to the other comment that he's a fisherman. So I think the idea of Peter making some kind of a mistake is highly plausible here. This may be worth exploring more in all of your commentaries, but I think your historical background commentary may speak to this. I haven't looked at this more. Had the sword struck again, many of the disciples would likely have been killed in the ensuing conflict. In antiquity, authorities sometimes settled for executing a movement's leader if they thought this action sufficient to destroy the movement, but any resistance would be met with force. Yeah, so regardless of Peter's goal and what he was after, I mean, this is a very violent life or death situation. I mean, that much is clear. And I've talked already about how the emotional intensity of this passage, I mean, it is just, told in a high register. It's just kind of an extreme situation. And so this now is physical violence. It is not, not that it's important that we pinpoint who started it per se. I mean, that's not the point of the passage, but the physicality as such starts with a kiss, which is interesting. I mean, there's a physical approach, but presumably they're just kind of looking at each other, and then we get this verbal rabbi, and then the first physical movement as Mark describes it, is a kiss, and then it gets even more physical. They put hands on him, they apprehend him, and now the physicality gets ratcheted up even more with this very violent act. And you could argue too, we talked about this last time. I mean, I think you can make a really good case that already in verse 46 there is some violence, that this is a violent seizing, not a sort of like, oh, please come with us, sir. Here are your rights. We're going to read them to you. Already this is a physically violent situation. So here we are in verse 47. It seems to be getting worse or more intense. What's going to happen next? Is there going to be a sword fight? Well, we'll go to verse 48. Jesus jumps in to diffuse the situation, or I'm not sure that's his intention, but that's what happens. Let's look at verse 48. And NA 28 here gives us a new paragraph. Kai apokrithes ha Jesus epinautois hos epilesten eselthate metamakairon haizulon sulaben me. And if we read left to right, we get, and answering, Jesus said to them, like a robber, criminal, bandit, have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Now this epilesten, if we just read it left to right, that's a little bit misleading, because it's not saying, have you come, as if you are a robber or a bandit. He's saying, have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me, accusative, as if I, Jesus, were a robber or a bandit. Note the matching masculine singular accusative. Thankfully, we get case matching in Greek. And so since we know that that matches, Mark confront this and have it not be confusing. You would not want to do this in English because it would be confusing. If you say, like a criminal, have you come to arrest me? That makes it sound like you are the criminal, and we just don't have case endings that clarify otherwise. So we're going to move this to the end of the sentence while also acknowledging that Mark has fronted this for focus. So here's how I've translated it. Then Jesus responded, have you really come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? And I note here, kai apokrithes, ha Jesus epinautois, and Jesus answered, saying to them, we get this formula that introduces speech. I'm translating that as then Jesus responded. You could say, as some translations do, then Jesus replied. Let's just look at the info pane here with the different verses. So verse lookup is selected. Let's see what we've got. Jesus answered and said unto them, so the ASV gives us the literal word by word rendering, but we get things like responded or just Jesus said to them. Jesus answered and said to them, Jesus said to them. I'm going with responded because the comma quote implies already that he said to them, but I think the responded here is important to show that Jesus does have a response to this act of violence. So the response is not to Peter, interestingly, as far as we can tell. I mean, it sure looks like he's talking. In fact, he is, because verse 49 will clarify that. He's talking to the apprehenders. Verse 49 will clarify that if it's not clear in verse 48. So Jesus, in Mark's account, is not saying, Peter, put away your sword, although he's not approving of it either. Mark's not giving us any response. Mark is having Jesus respond, or showing Jesus's response, I should say, to the ones coming to seize him. And his response is to say, have you really come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? So the sword is in verse 47. That's not the sword per se that Jesus is responding to. Although there are swords already in verse 43. So we've got swords here, and it's these swords and clubs that Jesus is responding to in verse 43. We could just confirm the wording on that. So I've got makairon, kaizulon, and we could take that phrase, turn off the live click. I'm going to I know I can just scroll up, but you can take this whole phrase, right click it, search for, and I'm going to do lexeme just in case it's not in the genitive earlier. And there's Mark 14:43. In fact, it was in the genitive there too. So we've got the same thing, a crowd with swords and clubs. So we've got the same meta makairon, kaizulon in verse 43. So he's responding to them, which I just find very interesting. And again, I would wonder, okay, well, what about this thing about telling Peter to put away his sword? Am I misremembering that? Am I making that up? Well, it's probably from a parallel gospel. So we can look at that and see. And there it is. Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back into its sheath. Now, again, this does not mean that by Mark's account or Mark's understanding of this passage that Jesus did not say that. It just means he didn't record that. And I think we need to read Mark on his own terms. And I just find that an interesting move in this narrative, that Jesus is not approaching Peter, although clearly in Mark, Jesus has no problem doing that when Peter's in the wrong. He's not justified here. That would be an argument from silence if we said, well, Jesus didn't address Peter, therefore it must be fine. But at any rate, whatever Mark's reasoning is, yeah, it is true from the parallel accounts that Jesus has said to Peter, put away your sword. So I wasn't just making things up. I had that in mind from the parallel account. We could see that very quickly in accordance. But here we get Jesus responding, have you, and by the way, another way to look at this verb here is seilthate, second person plural. And haste is one, that's singular. So that's another confirmation that he's talking to the larger crowd. I just mentioned here, hos epi leistein, like a criminal, is fronted in Greek for focus. And again, as I said, you can't really, I mean, maybe there's a creative way I haven't thought of, but I don't know how you could preserve that fronting in English in a way that would still be smooth enough for the reader to understand. So I would move that toward the end of the sentence. Let's talk about leistein for a moment. I've translated it as violent criminal, although I did not see that translation equivalent in BDAG or elsewhere. It's got a more specific translation. BDAG gives us robber, highwayman, bandit, revolutionary, insurrectionist, guerrilla. This second set of translation equivalents has more political connotations to it. And so that is a question for us. Is that what they're thinking with him? And I'm just going to give a short overview on this, but I think this is a word study that's worth spending a lot of time on. In fact, before I do that, let me just catch up on questions and comments. So why don't we pause there before we move to this word study, because I want to take some time with this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this word too. I've just copy and pasted some things here, but let me. Yeah, oh great, here's a comment back to Peter not being named. Somebody says, as Mark's source is probably Peter, as Mark was the secretary to Peter, and given Mark is written earlier than John, maybe Peter did not want his name out at the time of Mark writing his gospel. Peter being dead by the time John writes, there's no longer a protect Peter issue. Yeah, I think that's really possible. I think what would, I mean, yeah, and personally, we have seen Peter not protected elsewhere in Mark, where he is told to get behind Jesus, but maybe this is more of a level of shame and embarrassment that it's just named as one of. It could also just be, you know, what is Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is the best one, which isn't always true. I don't agree with Occam's razor, by the way, but if you do, maybe you say, well, Mark just stylistically said one of them standing there. So it could be as simple as that. But yeah, thanks for that comment. That's interesting. Looks like we've got some comment on, yeah, let me put this in the chat. For leistein, I'm just going to put this in the chat, and that's a good translation. Yep, there's for the word robber. Right, so I think most translations I looked at in commentaries end up with robber here. and I've even read commentaries saying that this word has even changed meaning over time. So even as the first century goes on, it takes on more of this revolutionary insurrectionist type meaning. The reason I translated it as violent criminal is because I think the violence is definitely in there. Lowe and Nida say it's one who robs by force and violence. To me, I don't think that so robber and insurrectionist are potentially two different things. I think both not being sure of that and the fact that I don't think robbing is necessarily the issue here. In other words, they're not going to take Jesus to trial for robbing. It's going to be for something more like blasphemy or whatever charges they're going to drum up against him. So I think the point here and what Mark is saying is that they're treating this like it's a criminal offense that he has committed, and in fact the crucifixion. I mean, he's going to get the death penalty, capital punishment. So I think this broader translation of criminal while also preserving the word violent, to me that makes sense in translation. But you've got some options here. You've got here the Theological Lexicon of the New Testament notes that this comes from the verb carrying off as plunder. So if you want to stick with that, you'll see a number of translations that do. They'll give you robber. Let's click this again, as you would, and then you've got outlaw here. Outlaw, this is criminal, CSB, I had seen that before. Robber, as though I were a criminal. Okay, good. So some other translations did do that. As against a robber you came out. Now this is, by the way, a nice way, and whether you think this is stylistically acceptable or not, it does a great job of, it preserves the fronting of epileistin, hos epileistin, as against a robber you came out. So it is preserving the Greek word order, which I think I've said before. I always want to try to do that if I can, and this has done it. Now, whether you think this is stylistically, going to pass your standards for translation, that's another question. But good effort on that. So that's interesting. All right, so we see a variety of translations here. France notes in his New International Greek Testament Commentary, this is a pejorative word. And then he goes on to talk about Josephus and the irony that Jesus will be crucified between two lestai, 1527, as if he were one of them. Now, the first place I would go in an extended word study would be to search this in the Gospels. Well, I'd actually start in Mark. So we've got some parallels here. We've got some other uses. Here it is with the house of prayer for all nations. Here's our passage, 1448, and then here is France, who makes this powerful connection to the crucifixion. We might just remember that when we get to 1527. So France draws that connection, and he says, thus from the beginning of the passion events to their end, Jesus finds himself unwillingly associated with the lestai, from whose ideology he had so deliberately distanced himself. NET note, it can refer to one who stirs up a rebellion. Josephus, although this usage generally postdates Jesus' time, it does refer to a figure of violence. So I'm abbreviating what I think could be a very fruitful and much longer study. And I'd love your comments or questions, especially if I'm leaving something out. But I think however you translate this word, I think the violence needs to be in there. And that's why I personally have not gone with robber, because I can imagine robber having connotations of stealth and at night, and just sneaking in and out, and maybe even trying to avoid violence, like you're just trying to get in and get out and steal the TV or something like that. So to me, whatever I do in translation, I want the violence brought out there, and that's also, I think, reflecting the swords and clubs. So it's that, I think, the context, before we even look at the word in Mark, we look at it in this verse, and this word is right here next to swords and clubs. And so Jesus is asking, are you coming violently against me as if I'm violent, as if you need to detain me by force, That's, I think, the gist of what's going on here. So it's an interesting word, and got some interesting choices here for translation. But again, I'm not sure that the particular crime of robbery or banditry or insurrection, I'm not sure that that's so much Mark's interest here, or even Jesus's interest in this quote. Of course, I could be wrong. I'm always open to that. Well, hopefully I'm always open to that. But here, again, the violence is what's being stressed. So now in verse 49, oh, actually, let's do just a bit more on verse 48. We had sulambano for this detain, is how I've translated it. And you'll find translations that just say apprehend, and that's fine, or seize or arrest. I just note this is not the krateo verb that we had before, earlier in the passage. And for me, you know, if you've got two different Greek words, even if it's a synonym, if possible, I would like to use two different English words so that I don't have a reader unwittingly say, oh, it's the same word here. Well, it's a different word. It's the same concept. I'm not sure it matters that much, but just personally in my, you know, drive to stick as close to the text as I can in translation, krateo before. So if I translated that, which I did apprehend, I'm going to just go for something else here. You could do seize or grasp, I think detain. And then if you get krateo again, which we will, then we just go back to how we translated that initially. And as far as the question itself, Jesus is not asking for a statement of fact. When Jesus has said, have you come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? The answer is yes. And Jesus doesn't not know the answer to that. It's clear to everyone. So it's a rhetorical question. And if you wanted to, I think the word really or seriously, it's not explicitly there, but I think because that's the intention, you can bring it out. I just put it in brackets to highlight this point for us to consider. So he's asking, have you really come, have you seriously come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? He's going to go on, which we'll get to in just a minute. He's going to say, you could have done this before. Here's krateo again, by the way, and I try to go back to apprehend. So yeah, Jesus is shifting the focus from Peter to the ones arresting him by force, trying to highlight the absurdity of this whole thing. And we'll see that more in just a moment in verse 49. But I'd love to hear comments or questions you've got, especially anything on lestes. Let me go back to that comment that was there that I put in the chat. Yeah, there's 1448, as you would against a robber. He is a thief and a robber, meaning different than thief or robber in John 10:1. Barabbas, yeah, far more criminal there because of the crucifixion. Right, that's an interesting point, and that's in John as well. Yeah, and we'll come back to this later in Mark. BDEG has to take into custody. That's great. Yeah, I like that. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because that's what they're doing. I mean, there's a trial coming. I mean, they're not, you know, coming to get him to execute him on the spot. Although you do start to wonder when the sword starts flying, but that's not what's going to happen. And in fact, Jesus is going to say a bit more in verse 49 that raises some kind of larger questions of interpretation and theology, but also is Mark and Jesus setting this in broader context, which is that there is another factor at hand, which is the fulfillment of the scriptures. So we'll move into that. Let me just make sure. Another comment, someone on Peter's reputation, not his reputation, but his physical safety. Okay, interesting. That's a great thought. So the idea being that if Peter is anonymizing himself, or if Mark is anonymizing Peter here, it wouldn't be to protect his reputation, but so that people wouldn't go after him. Although my guess would be word travels fast, but that's a great, to me, that's a very plausible interpretation as well. So thanks for that clarification. All right, Jesus is getting detained. He's asking about it. We've got one of them striking the ear of the servant. Let's go to Mark 14:49, where Jesus's speech continues. I'll go back to accordance for this. Kath hemeran hemen proshumas into hiero didaskon kai uk ekratesa teme alhina plerothosin hi graphi. Let's go left to right first. According to day or every day, I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not, there's krateo again, apprehend me or arrest me. However you translated it before, I would just suggest translating it the same way. And you did not arrest me, but in order that may be fulfilled, or in order that would be fulfilled, the scriptures or the writings. We've got an interesting, apparently a sentence fragment there that we're going to wonder about and figure out in translation. But here's how I ended up after I worked through this verse. Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not apprehend me. But, brackets, this is happening now in order to fulfill the scriptures. So kath hemeran is day after day or every day. The implication being you have had plenty of opportunity. I was regularly with you, if you wanted to translate it that way. But I think every day is nice and specific. Krateo again, apprehend. Yeah, what about this apparent sentence fragment? Well, there's a device called ellipsis in Greek. We've seen this before, and I was looking for a good definition of this. So to prepare the handout, I did something that you can do when a word pops into your head and you're wondering, is that really ellipsis or is that called something else? The NT Greek Pocket Dictionary. I'm going to click that open. It's already open to ellipsis. If it weren't, I could just start typing, and there it is. I get ellipse, I get ellipsis. I put this in your handout, but it's the omission of an element of language that technically renders the sentence ungrammatical, but that is usually understood in context. And it just reminds us that everyday speech is frequently elliptical. I bet if you look for ellipses in conversations for the rest of today, you will find them left and right. The question is, do we translate an ellipsis as an ellipsis? Now, if you can, I think great. And again, personally, that's my goal. If you can preserve the word order, as much as you can bring over one-to-one, to me, in my opinion, the more the better, in a way that's still readable. I don't think that's really possible here. If you wanted to, it would look like this. But in order that the writings, or I would say the scriptures, but in order that the scriptures might be fulfilled, ... So that's pulling it over in a more kind of one-to-one way. I think this would be confusing to a reader. If you are the only reader of your translation, if you know you're going to come back to this later and it's just going to be you, maybe you put that there. I would put some kind of note there though. So this is omission of an element of language, and I put the brackets there just to show that the Greek is not actually saying this is happening now, but that is the idea. The NASB and the King James both will do either brackets or italics, or here's the ASV. I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and ye took me not, but, sorry, this font is small, here we go. But that the scriptures might be fulfilled, but then they put in, this is done in italics to show, and then you can read this off of the surface text. Oh, this is not in Greek, but it's here to make sense in English. So I have always found that an elegant solution. Some Bibles in print don't use italics at all and don't use brackets at all. So then you've got to figure out what to do with that. Many translations don't show you that they're kind of unellipsising the sentence, if that's a word. You just get it brought out in English. You can see a diagram too. The diagrams in accordance are good about this. They will also, because what the diagrams are trying to do is show you the grammar of the sentence. So they put something in parentheses here. So we've got, but this happens, or this is happening in order that the writings or the scriptures might be fulfilled. So if you want to know how does this make sense grammatically, well, it doesn't until you fill it out this way. That's what's understood. So you've got the subject, this, you've got the verb, gegonen is happening, and then you get what's actually written in the sentence in order that the scriptures would be fulfilled. I suggest, and I've mentioned this before, we've seen that Greek favors the subjunctive, where in English, I think maybe more archaic English, you might still have that, but I think we're more likely to use the infinitive now. You can see here with older versions like the ASV, but this is done that the scriptures might be fulfilled. So they have done what they preserved that subjunctive from Greek into English. If that feels archaic to you, you are just as likely to hear somebody say this happened to fulfill the scriptures. Interestingly, we get with the ESV, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. But the scriptures must be fulfilled in another translation. You can see here in this Spanish version, more italics here. So this is something that the ellipsis kind of confronts us with the decision. The first decision is how much do we fill it out, if at all? And then the second one is if we fill it out, with what do we fill it out? Now, this is happening now. That's introducing a pronoun, a demonstrative pronoun that does not have a clear reference. So there's another question now. Do I clarify? Do I get even more specific? Do I say, but the arrest is happening now in this way in order to fulfill the scriptures? And at a certain point, to me as a translator, I think, well, I don't want to over translate this. And it, there's not a very specific reference as to what exactly is happening that would fulfill the scriptures. I mean, I think it's the arrest in this way, but maybe it's talking about the whole narrative. I'm not really sure. Mark didn't specify. So I think less is more. And in this case, I think something like an ambiguous "this is happening" is the way to go. And I think the ESV is interesting, but let the scriptures be fulfilled is an interesting take on it. Hagiography is the writings. You can recognize that graph. In English, we've got paragraph, we've got graffiti, we've got typography. This could just mean the writings in general, but given this talk of fulfillment, these are, and the definite article too, I think, this is a specific piece of writings, and it's a specific meaning, a specific nuance that graphe can have, which is sacred writings. So in this case, the scriptures. And so I would not translate it the writings unless you did the sacred writings, but this is talking about the scriptures. I think you'll be hard pressed to find any translation that just says the writings. You've got scriptures pretty much across the board here. And that's in fact what Jesus is saying, that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Again, this, in terms of Mark's context and word studies, this makes me wonder, all right, where else has Jesus talked about scripture being fulfilled in Mark? And we might just take a moment to go look at that and see, well, this is the time is fulfilled. And then this is the first time the word fulfilled is mentioned. So that's interesting. Matthew is a little bit different, a lot different maybe. We've got the fulfillment of scripture as a theme pretty frequently in the first 5 chapters. So it's just interesting that Mark hasn't emphasized that theme as much, but here he is, Jesus is, he's quoting Jesus. So however you decide to fill that out or not, here's how I've translated it, and then we'll move to comments and questions. Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not apprehend me. But this is happening now in order to fulfill the scriptures. And this hina is a purpose word, so it is in order. And you might even look at that more, but BDAG gives it as a marker to denote purpose. It even puts this verse, where is it? You just navigate down by hit. It puts it under meaning number 2, marker of objective, that. So it's possible that the purpose is weakened here, but that's another question to consider. Let me go to your comments and questions. Every day is why the quotes around entire verse 49, it's not a quote. is a quote. It's Jesus. It continues Jesus' response. Unless I'm missing something, have you really come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? I just put a new quote here because it's not a new paragraph, but it's a new section in the handout. Yeah, I suppose you could ask if this fulfillment piece is Mark talking. Does the quote end here? That's a difficult question. Here's another comment. Matthew uses fulfill, seems to be writing to Jews to whom fulfillment would mean something. Mark seems aimed at Romans who could care less about fulfilling pagan scripture. I'm curious now about 49 to see. I don't know if there's any translation that understands this as being Mark speaking, but let's take a look. Yeah, I think every translation that I've got anyway is understanding this as part of the quote. And that would seem an odd interjection for Mark, especially since he hasn't talked about fulfillment yet, but it is possible. I would check the commentaries on that. But yeah, this is still Jesus speaking from verse 48. All right, well, we get this, we're gonna stop with a very short verse today, verse 50. It's not quite the end of the passage because we've got almost a little afterword here with this mysterious figure in 51 and 52, this young man running off naked, which is, we can look at that in parallel accounts too, but we'll stop at verse 50 today. Kai aphantes auton, ephugon pantes. And leaving him, everybody fled. Pantes is not more specific than everyone in terms of the language here. We just get Pontes. We don't get all of. Sometimes you'll get Pontes and then followed by a genitive, and it will say it's all of a class of people. The NET decides that it's going to clarify here for the sake of understanding. It says then all the disciples. Now their notes acknowledges in Greek it's just they, or just all, or they all. But it says the referent, Jesus' disciples, has been specified in the translation for clarity. And you just want to ask, well, is that actually the referent? Is that open to interpretation? But it cannot be that everyone on the whole scene is leaving Jesus, because then he would be not under arrest anymore. And as we go on, we see there's still people left there. There are people that now try to krateo this young man. And then in verse 53, this crowd is leading Jesus to the high priest. So they're still there. So yeah, I think the NET is right. This Pontes is not referring to literally everyone in the whole scene. The scene is actually still continuing, or it's shifting. There's going to be some movement. But again, Mark just says everyone, so I've translated it as everyone. I don't disagree with the NET. The only question for you as a translator is how much do you want to bring out what's implied for the sake of clarity versus how much do you want to stick to Pontes just means everyone and I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's a question of translation philosophy, maybe even personal preference. But that's why the NET has this, but I just have then everyone left him and fled. I think we've got another participle of attendant circumstance here. So we've got aphantes and ephugon both in the aorist, and so participle indicative verb. It looks in the diagrams like this, where you've got the participle grammatically subordinate to the indicative verb, but as we've seen, you can translate this as two indicative verbs, two main verbs. I do wonder, though, why two words at all? Because this really is just kind of like Mark could just say they're running away from Jesus, and you could translate it that way. I just wondered, though, is Mark wanting to emphasize not just their fleeing, not just their leaving the scene, but is he wanting to emphasize they're leaving auton, Jesus? And I think so. I mean, again, that's open to interpretation, but I think because of this auton here, I want to keep this as two verbs. In other words, you could translate this as one verb if you want. I think that would probably be justified, something like everyone got out of Dodge. But I think this auton here, I want to preserve that because I do think this is recapitulating the theme of one of you will betray me, and in fact, you know, none of you are staying awake, so really you're all deserting me already, and then they're doing it again here. So this pantes, disciples implied, and this apphentes auton, this left him ephugon and fled. I think even though this is the same movement, I think this auton focusing on Jesus, I think that's important and poignant too. We've seen Jesus predict this, and we've seen it already happening. Can't you stay awake? Stay with me. Don't fall into temptation. You know, he's basically saying, join me in this, and they're not. And now, even after three, I don't know if you want to call these warnings or reprimands or whatever, even after 3 times of Jesus saying, stick with me on this, they leave. So it's very sad, very poignant. Whether it's surprising or not, I don't know whether readers of the narrative find this surprising, but we're going to get this interesting afterword in verse 51. We'll start there next week, and then we'll move into the trial. But let me just stop there for today and see what other questions or comments you've got. You might just think about, by the way, and we'll look at this more next week, do you start a new paragraph here or not? We can look at what different translations do. I do think this is a pretty stark ending point here. I think it's a powerful and poignant statement. So I think starting a new paragraph makes sense, but we'll look at that more next week as we wrap up this particular passage. Any comments or questions you've got, especially if you haven't asked anything yet today and have been wondering about it, I'd invite you to put that in the chat and I'll respond. Let me just remind you as we take a moment to do that, that this handout, if you didn't download it today, or if you're watching on the recording, you can get it from tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. It's there now. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. All questions and comments are welcomed if you want to get in touch with me. And if you want to go back to part 1 or anything previous to that, those are all housed in the tiny URL link, which takes you to a shared Google folder.